to conduct research that brings national and state evidence to bear on New Mexico's education policy context. We should have a summary report of our work. It's about 25 pages long. We will soon be releasing our full report, and we'll get it right to you, which has much more. It's about 125 pages long, much more detailed analysis and much more detail in the recommendations. Our hope, especially for LESC, is that our work complements and supports the work you've been engaged with as a committee, I know, over the past several years. So let me turn it over to Carmen to get us going.
The purpose of this study was to provide New Mexico leaders, including all of you, a research perspective on the challenges facing education and identify evidence-based ways that state policy can address them. We posed a set of research questions that, when answered with evidence, could support New Mexicans to develop policies that leverage positive changes throughout the system. There is a lot of background noise. Are you all hearing that too?
Yes.
So maybe people need to put their on mute. They need to put on mute.
Everybody that is listening but forgot to mute, please mute. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next slide. Our research included interviews, site visits, document review, and new analyses of data provided by the New Mexico Department of Public Education. Using these data to answer our questions, we identified challenges and evidence-based strategies for implementation and sustainability grounded in an understanding of the state's context, capacity, and needs. Next. Before we start our findings, we want to ask out loud, what's on everybody's mind? How can we even think about long-term system improvement in New Mexico, given the profound changes and incredible turmoil brought by COVID-19? We are on the next slide, Jeannie. How can we think about new investments when painful cuts will be necessary but yet unknown? We will turn to this throughout our presentation, but the short answer is that we make types of recommendations. One, relatively low-cost, short-term actions that could be taken now, as well as two, broader, longer-term steps that can be made when the economy rebounds. Both steps of high quality, equitable, and culturally sustained.
Excuse me, Carmen.
Yes.
Jeannie, if you'll mute yours and Carmen, go ahead. We're still receiving an echo. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah. So how much of that did you? Anyway. But what we're going to do with this is we'll return to this throughout our presentation to the question of what are we going to do now that with COVID. So we have two types of recommendations. One, relatively low-cost, short-term actions that can be taken now, as well as two, broader, longer-term steps that can be made when the economy rebounds. Both are steps of high quality, equitable, and culturally sustaining education in New Mexico. Next. We're going on to the next slide, Jeannie.
Able to advance it from here, so I don't know whether something can be done there.
Oh.
It says I'm sharing the PowerPoint, but
You can't advance it?
no, I can't advance it. Oh, here, did that advance it?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry about that. We want to start out by giving you the 4 big findings, and then we'll walk you through each of these and give some more detail. Unfortunately, what you'll get today is just examples of what we've done, and the summary report and the big report have much more details about both our findings and our recommendations. And somebody suggested that we think about this as kind of the what of our LPI research, and the how is much more provided in detail in the long report. So we'll begin by describing some characteristics of New Mexico that must be taken into account when considering problems and solutions in education. I mean, everybody here says that New Mexico is different, and in fact, New Mexico is different, and we have to pay attention to that. With these differences or characteristics in mind, we'll describe how New Mexico measures up on 5 pillars of the system that have been the focus of reforms in countries and states that have made dramatic improvements in their education systems. These pillars include meaningful learning goals, well-qualified educators, supports for meeting students' needs, high-quality early education, and adequate and equitable funding. And then we'll finish by recommending how the system's accountability system could be changed in ways that increase the capacity of the system and increase the chances that improvements will be implemented well on the ground. So, what complicates education in New Mexico? Well, some of the things we're most proud of and some of the things we are least proud of. I think, our diversity is such a wonderful asset, a strength, and it positions the state to prepare students for this increasingly interconnected, multicultural, multilingual world. But it also makes achieving a statewide system of effective schools very complex. As some of the speakers this morning pointed out, that one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work when you have different districts that are as different as rural Mosquero with 34 students who are mostly white, urban Albuquerque with 91,000 students from 26 different language backgrounds, and I believe from 88 federally recognized tribes, and Gallup-McKinley, whose 11,000 students are nearly all Navajo, Hopi, and Zuni. So leaving, and in fact, I think recognizing this, the leaving educations to local communities through local control has really been the state's historical and still current approach to governance in this very diverse state. But the rub is that effective local control requires extremely high levels of capacity. It takes resources, knowledgeable school educators, institutional stability, and processes that support high-quality implementation and daily operations. Unfortunately, many districts have limited capacity, and that's not an insult to anybody, but we have a lot of places where there's a great deal of turnover and a lack of strong infrastructure. And the state, in its recent efforts to improve the education in New Mexico, has probably just not spent enough attention and resources to provide the strong capacity that an effective state school system requires. A second consideration that nobody's happy about is that we have an economy that's very distressed. We've been unable to lift a large portion of children out of poverty. Nearly half of the schools in the state serve large concentrations of students from low-income families. That means like 80% or more. And the barriers to school success that poverty creates, they can be mitigated. Poverty doesn't prevent learning, but it creates barriers that have to be addressed to learning. But that can only be done with an investment of sufficient resources and supports. But the other problem with New Mexico's weak economy is that the revenue and income are exceptionally low, and the state has not had an opportunity or the ability to provide sufficient resources. So what do we do about that? We concluded that whatever we do in education has to be done in the complicated New Mexico way, one that takes advantages of the diversity and puts overcoming the barriers at the center of the system. And here's sort of what we, just in a nutshell, think about the New Mexico way. The diversity is an asset. It has to be recognized, and that poverty doesn't prevent kids from learning, but it does create the need for doing things differently. And in fact, we often think about kids who are affected by marginalization or poverty as the exceptions, that we build an education system and have kids with disabilities, and we provide extra supports in the system for them. But I think we need to turn that upside down and to say, these are the students who must be placed at the center of the system, and we must build a system around their needs. Now, the good thing about that, one good thing about that is that it makes New Mexico students, most of them, the focus of our attention, but it also is, if you can address their needs well, we have plenty of evidence that you're creating a system that's going to work well for kids who are not disadvantaged. So this is not a Robin Hood strategy. It's just to say, shift the focus, and we'll have a much better chance of creating a system that works everywhere. And finally, the districts and schools require more capacity and support to make the most of diversity and reduce barriers. So as we look at these 5 elements, it matters what you build capacity around. It matters what your policies are, even if you're going to allow for enormous diversity, local flexibility, and focus on providing supports kids need. That we know from, and I think you and LESC, because you've done some studying of this, that research tell us that states and nations that have effective and have been dramatically improved in their systems of education have attended to these 5 fundamental elements. The top-rated states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey have all worked on these things, and states like North Carolina and California that used to be at the bottom of the national rankings and have risen substantially have also done it by paying attention to these 5 elements. It's just the task here is to figure out how to tackle these in a way that fits New Mexico. So in our research, we went through each one of these 5 things and identified specific goals that seem to fit the New Mexico context. We provide the evidence base, what we know from research about why these particular goals and directions have a good chance of being effective and effective here. We've done an overview of what the current status is in each of these 5 areas in New Mexico, and recognizing that all of you and the governor and advocates and others have all made in the last almost 2 years now some pretty extraordinary progress. To talk about that progress and then say, now going forward, what are some short-term steps that can be done in this area during our COVID recovery? And then what are some long-term steps that we ought to be keeping on the agenda and be planning for over the long term? So let me start with the first one, which is meaningful learning. Kind of a no-brainer. But the state, adopting high standards is good, but it's not enough. The state really needs to have a set of specific goals for student learning that can build on the strengths of the state's diversity and confront the barriers that poverty brings. So this doing it the New Mexico way. And while the Common Core standards and the Next Generation Science standards especially may be wonderful things, but they alone can't suffice as the goals for learning in New Mexico. So what we pulled out is that the state must have a goal of developing high-level cognitive skills in the core academic disciplines by engaging all students in critical and creative investigation of scientific, social, historical, literacy, artistic, and mathematical ideas. Doesn't mean that kids don't need basic skills, but it means that the goal, the emphasis should be on developing these high-level skills in the disciplines, and to use assessments that will measure it and encourage the system to focus on it. Second is that to make learning culturally and linguistically relevant, to ground students' new learning in their prior experiences, cultural knowledge, and linguistic background. And as I'll say in a minute, we have a lot of evidence about that too. And the second part of a whole child approach, or a second part, the cognitive part, is really a whole child as well. But these are often thought of as extras rather than being at the core, is to include social and emotional learning and trauma-informed practices to address the learning barriers that come from having the highest child poverty rate in the nation, including a very high incidence of children with adverse childhood experiences. And again, I want to emphasize these shouldn't be treated as preventions, but rather obstacles that we collectively need to overcome. And then finally, integrating college and career preparation in ways that make high schools much more engaging and relevant for young people, and ease, without sacrificing academic rigor, and ease the transition from high school to productive participation in post-secondary education and work. So now we lay this out in great detail, and it's impossible to read this slide, but this diagram is really about what we know from research about whole child. If you're going to pay attention to the cognitive, social, emotional, academic, physical, and psychological development all at one time. And I think you're going to hear from what's her name? Muriel Yang, Professor Yang from USC, who will talk, I suspect, when she talks about her neuroscience work, talks directly about how these things are integrated and need to be treated as a whole. And there's a great deal of evidence. The other thing that may be a little counterintuitive is that research shows that instruction that focuses on inquiry and complex problem solving improves academic performance, including on state tests and graduation rates, and that focus on higher level thinking has great benefits for both kids who start out as high achievers and kids who are low achievers. Okay, so what do we recommend? Drawing on all this work, I'll give you an example of a couple of the recommendations. And the short-term recommendations are in blue, and the longer-term recommendations are in red. And you'll see that both of these are about building capacity. But let me say first, the state really has done a lot of progress toward these four goals that I've mentioned. Certainly the next generation science standards are really a model of guidance for cognitive thinking and inquiry-based instruction. Ignited the interest in linguistically responsive education, I think, in a really terrific way. And what educators need to remember that it's not just being supportive and affirming of cultural and linguistic absolutely important and necessary, but in fact, the evidence we have from brain research and the learning sciences suggests that, in fact, it's essential to tap into kids' cultural and linguistic backgrounds for their brains to be able to work as effectively and nimbly as is possible for them to do. So this is also about learning strategy. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, but occasionally you'll break up. It's not real bad.
Okay, is it okay now?
It seems to be.
Okay. So the second set of recommendations. So the first set of recommendations here suggests that, you know what, in the interim, while we're waiting to recover, we could do things like develop online hubs that provide a huge amount of resources to local districts around this deeper learning, cultural and linguistic responsiveness, and SEL. I mean, these are not things that people have at the tip of their fingers, and they need a lot of support and access. And there are a lot of things that are around, things that have been developed in New Mexico, but we don't have an efficient system for making sure that they get into the hands of the people who need them when they need them. But over the long haul, I think we need to invest more in high-quality curriculum frameworks, instructional materials, and particularly in assessments. Assessments do more to shape instruction than just about anything else, and we need assessments that focus in on these 4 learning goals, and of course, professional development. Now, in the area of career pathways, I think what we can probably do immediately, because this is a whole different way of thinking about CTE, and the state does have some pilot projects that are working now, but I don't believe any of them are really trying to integrate the CTE with academics in a more applied focus that has both college preparation and lots of work-based learning, and has supports for kids built in. And I think that it's going to take probably a cross-sector group of educators, people from Workforce Solutions, industry partners, to really think hard about developing a framework and some standards for college and career pathways in New Mexico. It's a term that people use and like, but I don't think we've yet been rigorous about defining what that means. And then, to borrow from the case of the example of California, in California, they invested in a Pathways Trust, which is a public-private partnership with money, almost like the early childhood trust here, set aside for the purpose of supporting the development and sustaining of these new career and college pathways. So we spell that out more too. Okay, so I'll shift back to Carmen now.
Okay. A strong educator workforce is foundational to the success of New Mexico's public education system. Knowledgeable and skillful educators are the most important in-school influence on student learning and the most important element in closing the achievement gap. A significant body of national research demonstrates that teacher experience, preparation, and qualifications influence student achievement, especially with respect to the achievement of students of color and those from low-income families. For example, the combined effects on student learning gains of having a teacher who is well-prepared, experienced, and national board certified is greater than the combined effects of race and parent education. Next. You have a next.
Are you there, Jeannie?
Well, I'm waiting on the next slide.
Maybe somebody could give me some advice. It's when I when I mute myself, it seems that I can't advance the slides.
Jeannie, if you could use the right click button.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mexico must do the following to teacher supply in critical content areas and locations in ways that fill all positions with well-qualified teachers who understand the state's diverse cultures and languages. We use nutrition by providing strong preparation, support, and mentoring. Mentoring is so important, as well as competitive compensation. And improve effectiveness with stronger pre-service preparation and ongoing professional development. Okay, next. So in 2019, about 15% of New Mexico teachers left the teaching profession. That is nearly double the most recent nationwide numbers. The shortages diminished slightly in 2019, likely due to increased teacher salaries, but I'm afraid they're going to decrease again because of COVID and the teaching that they're required to do now. But the most recent data point to a teacher workforce in which large numbers of New Mexico teachers are both underprepared and inexperienced. And we are just beginning to learn how COVID will make the shortage worse. Next. Because of the shortages and high turnover, in 2019, New Mexico's percentage of inexperienced teachers was 19%, double the national average of 9%. Research shows that inexperienced teachers are less effective than those with more than 3 years of experience. New teachers typically have high attrition rates, creating churn that also depresses student achievement. This problem is not evenly distributed. Schools serving the most economically disadvantaged students on average have nearly twice the percentage of new teachers, 36%, compared to schools with few disadvantaged students, 19%. They are even more concentrated in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces, where the average percentage rises to 25%. Lessening shortages and attrition requires attention to the costs of becoming a teacher, quality of preparation and support, coaching, mentoring, opportunities for collaboration and professional learning. Compensation matters, from wages and benefits to loan forgiveness and housing costs. It all counts for a more equitable distribution of qualified teachers. Next. During the past 2 years, New Mexico has passed important legislation to strengthen its educator workforce, including raising teacher salaries, revising the state equalization guarantee formula to distribute funding for teachers through a new teacher cost index, investing in high retention pathways into teaching, including teacher residency and other grow your own programs, funding teacher mentoring for first-year teachers, and increasing its investments in principal professional learning. Though some of these investments were scaled back in the 2020 special session in response to COVID-19. But much more needs to be done. Here are a couple of examples of long and short-term steps that can help. One set focused on improving preparation, the other set focused on increasing retention with high-quality mentoring. Next. Schools can't fix poverty, but they can mitigate the educational disadvantages associated with it. In New Mexico, with half of schools serving high-poverty communities, this means that providing extra supports can't be seen as add-ons for those students who need them. These supports must be built into the regular approach to schooling. Next. Although all high-poverty schools allow all high-poverty schools to become community schools is one evidence-based strategy. Schools vary by community, but they are built on 4 pillars. One pillar, expanded learning time, has already proven effective in New Mexico, even though it has faced implementation challenges. Next. Comprehensive community schools, those with the 4 pillars including expanded learning time, make a positive impact on attendance, academic achievement, particularly for math, high school graduation rates, and reduced racial and economic achievement gaps. Plus, cost-benefit studies find savings up to $15 for every dollar invested. Next. The state's 2013 Community Schools Act allowed any public school to become a community school, but the state provided no funding or other support for high-quality implementation and sustainability. Partnerships in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Cruces have created more than 36 community schools, as well as have some tribally controlled schools, some with impressive results. However, they vary considerably in the extent and quality of their implementation and as a consequence in their achievements. The legislature's 2019 amendments provided $2 million 3.3 million was appropriated in 2020, which is really a drop in the bucket considering the scope of the problem and the high level of interest. The 2 million allocated in 2019 was sufficient to fund less than a third of the applicants, and the 2020 allocation won't allow the program to expand. The small PED community schools team is knocking themselves out to support these schools, but no funds have been committed yet to providing the capacity and professional development that strong and sustainable implementation requires. Next. In the near term, PED can support districts to blend and braid funds, including funds for at-risk students, expanded learning time, and grants through the Indian Education Act, as well as federal Title I and 21st Century Learning funding, and funding from other agencies. The Children's Cabinet could ease the way for combined applications, budgets, and reporting. This would increase access as well as create efficiencies by avoiding duplication of supports for families. In the long term, the state can move toward funding all high-poverty schools to use this approach. For capacity building in the near term, New Mexico PED can target professional development on competencies required for managing successful community schools and expanded learning time, including collaboration with communities and tribes, and blending and braiding funding. In the longer term, the legislature should invest in regional support centers to help districts implement community schools and expanded learning effectively, including tribal collaboration where appropriate. This could be part of a larger state effort to increase the regional capacity of New Mexico PED related to improving learning opportunities and effectiveness. Next. So New Mexico has made great strides toward making publicly supported high-quality early childhood education available to more children. However, the gains made now need to be protected, and much work remains to be done. Although recommending policy directions in early childhood is beyond the purview of this project, we certainly encourage the state to stay the course. It's back to you, Jeannie.
Can you hear me now? Yes. So let's turn to money, because key to all of this and key to being able to center the needs of our wonderfully diverse but too often poor New Mexico kids is to have adequate and equitable funding. And what's hard here is that New Mexico, over the last 5 decades, has devoted a substantial share of its limited dollars to education. It always, whenever you see rankings about school finance systems, you see New Mexico does pretty well when it comes to level of effort that the citizens are making to supporting an education system. It's also been heralded, rightly so, as having a funding formula that distributes funding more equally than most other states. That's all good, and it's a great foundation to build on. But what's not so good is that overall spending has been low historically, and it's still not enough to meet the needs of students who face barriers from poverty and or marginalization. Effective interventions and supports work, but they aren't cheap. So, now I can't advance my own. Can somebody there help me advance this slide?
Jeannie, can you use the arrows on your keyboard? If that isn't working...
Well, let me just talk. Recent studies demonstrate that where more money has been spent on education for students from low-income families, achievement and graduation rates improve. For a long time, we thought that money didn't matter. And in fact, it turns out that the careful and rigorous research that's been done over the last 20 years, in fact, says it does matter. And it matters most for students from low-income families. It matters in that it improves achievement and graduation rates. It improves life outcomes such as employment, wages, and reduced poverty rates. But of course, it matters how money is spent. Research points to 3 goals for leveraging money, using money, both new money and existing funds, to achieve adequate and equitable schooling. Is one, the money has to be used in ways that point the system toward the right goals for learning. The second, it has to ensure that the state has an adequate supply of well-prepared teachers, without which no other reform can work. And third, it needs to provide sufficient funding to support the needs of children whose learning needs are greater because of poverty, language, or disability. Let's see if I can. Well, this is really awful.
Jeannie, it looks like you might have selected on your slides, which is preventing you to advance.
Aha, how do I get rid of it?
There should be a bar on the left-hand side that controls that.
Is she right? I'm getting it, Rachel, in my email. Jeannie, it's Rachel. We're trying
I
to
so
pull it up.
apologize.
We're trying to pull it up on our computer here. And so we will control it. And if you just let us
Okay,
know
well,
next
I'll just
slide.
keep talking and hopefully you have, maybe you have copies of the slides to look at. That would be great. Again, the good news here in New Mexico is that there's been a lot of recent progress made both in adequacy and equity. That significant funding increases in the 19 and 20 sessions amounted to a total increase of $672 million. And this providing, and again, this goes to the need to use the resources strategically for students whose needs are complicated. So even after the special session, New Mexico's spending, and this is hot off our presses, our analysis, the spending is about $12,000 per pupil compared to the national average this year of $13,200. The gap then is $1,100 of Mexico lagging behind the national average. But this represents incredible progress. In 2018, the gap was over $3,000 per student. So what you guys have done over the last 2 years has really reduced the gap between us and the national average. And relatively modest increases, and we have a chart in the report that shows how increases over 5 to 8 years, not in this year or next, but after when we start to recover, could really close these gaps entirely. Now, more needs to be done. First, the state needs to consider new strategies for increasing okay, let's see if we... Oh, you got it, good. We're on slide 28. So what we recommend is that the governor and the legislature together propose a task force of really high-level people across sectors to think about revenue strategies in New Mexico, to really think hard about this is not a problem that can be solved by unpredictable increases in oil and gas, but we need to think of other strategies. Obviously, revenue sources is beyond the scope of our research, but we really think that New Mexico needs to tackle this problem. And that would then enable the state to increase funding over the next 5 to 8 years to reach the national average. Now, the national average goal is reasonable for New Mexico. I mean, people say because of the cost of living here, we don't need as much money. And in fact, it may not require as high a level of spending to achieve high quality as it does in Connecticut or Massachusetts and New Jersey. But if we were at the national average, it would cover the entire cost of the state's more than 1,000 vacant instructional positions. It could increase teacher salaries above the regional average, and it could provide additional funding between 90 and 128 million each year to fund the other sort of policy recommended, but certainly fund the recommendations in this report. Bringing equity in school resources can be done by continuing to increase the formula weight for at-risk students, and that is a good idea. But what some states have done, and I think is really a good idea, because we know that concentrated poverty is far more burdensome than just simply the sum of the individual poor children that you have in a community or school. So some states have an extra weight in their formula, a concentration factor. So it's additional money goes directly to those districts and schools with high levels of concentrated poverty. Okay, we can go to the next one. Are you guys advancing slides? Good. So a consistent theme throughout all of our data collection is that many New Mexico districts currently lack the capacity to implement programs effectively, support professional growth, or to allocate and use funding well. This is not only a complaint by people at the states. This is also a story that's told by local educators, local education leaders, school board members, that in fact the capacity isn't there to do the kind of work people would really like to do. And in fact, New Mexico's had accountability over the past 2 decades, but it's followed a trend that really swept education policy and was incorporated into the federal No Child Left Behind law in 2002. It's a very top-down approach. I know you guys know it well, but the expectation is that schools, teachers, and kids would do much better if the state set specific test score improvement targets and then administered a regime of sanctions on those who didn't meet the targets, ranging from public labeling to the threat of closing schools. The biggest problem the system believed was thought to be a lack of effort rather than a lack of capacity to improve. But the policy of high-stakes testing without investing or supporting improvement did not meet its intended goals. And that was not only in New Mexico, that's everywhere that it was tried. And here, the reading and math scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which had increased some during the Richardson administration when there was a greater investment in teaching and in learning supports, but it stalled around 2011, and some scores have actually declined. And as we all know too well, the whole education profession in New Mexico was badly demoralized, and it may have contributed to our shortage problems. Okay, next slide. Well, the research on effective accountability suggests a very, very different approach. Effective accountability systems focus both on the performance of the system and on the conditions and opportunities underlying that performance. So it's able to shed a light on barriers and facilitators of improvement, including inputs, processes, and outcomes that produce student learning. They do not presume that information about outcomes is sufficient for improvement. Effective systems not only establish performance goals and evaluate schools' progress toward meeting them, but also monitor whether states and districts provide the resources and support schools need to meet these goals. You probably heard the PED talk about reciprocal accountability. This is exactly what they're talking about, that it's not just the people who are in school buildings who have to be held accountable for doing their part, so does everyone in the state. So effective systems have a mix of state direction and support and oversight and local autonomy to align state and local goals and priorities, strengthen governance, and provide schools and districts the flexibility they need to serve their diverse communities effectively. Next slide, please. Now, fortunately, from the new accountability measure that you passed 2 years ago to the implementation efforts at the PED, New Mexico has made some key changes to its approach in accountability since January 2019. These changes have moved the system toward one that is more effective. The most counterproductive elements are now gone, school grades and teacher effectiveness ratings that nobody understood. Our recommendations here are to strengthen these current efforts to develop the state's accountability system into one that really supports improvement by building the knowledge and skills of school boards and educators as well as their communities. Next slide, please. So in the near term, and this has to do with, again, pointing the system in the right direction, the state could, and there's several local ones and some, nonprofit groups have led efforts to do this, and Albuquerque has done this, to develop a profile of the New Mexico graduate to make the state's goals crystal clear and much more concrete, and include in that profile what we expect in terms of achievement, cultural and linguistic proficiency, and college and career readiness. To make that profile work, we need to develop the state's new system, which is already multiple measures and dashboards, which are good things, but to include metrics of progress toward all the outcomes in the profile, as well as indicators that provide insight into the resources and opportunities underlying that process. So that's one set of thinking about accountability. Again, these are just two of several recommendations we have in the report. The other is to think about the budget process, budget planning and review process as part of this more general support-based accountability system. So to require districts to use a community-engaged process to specify how local spending will provide research-based support toward the learning goals and for at-risk students, and fulfill things like the Indian Education Act requirements, Hispanic education requirements, and bilingual multicultural education. But to really use that budget planning process as a way to have this broader conversation about what capacity we need and how do we get it and how do we use it, our budget, to move us toward those goals. And now that takes a lot of technical assistance, and we know right now that PED has an accountability unit, but it is not a unit set up to provide all of this kind of support. And we think in the long term that we should have regional education centers. It could be the RECs, it could be centers located in universities or some sort of regional place distributed that can provide technical assistance and conduct school reviews and review local plans and really help teach people how to use their budget as a tool to achieve their goals and their accountability data to both pinpoint problems and to highlight potential places of good movement. So it's about thinking about accountability in a very, very different way. So next, please. Support that this kind of improvement takes slow and steady, comprehensive learning and change. It has to be championed by those outside the system and elected office, as well as within those roles of responsibility. It's too long-term to be accomplished within the term of any political cycle or governor's term, and it must be protected from the vagaries of political transition, so that a plan like this, our plan toward these goals, needs to be something that can continue and feel like it's part of what's owned by whoever is in political power. And this is more than ever as New Mexico recovers from the pandemic, because it means because we don't know the full effects yet and recovery is likely to be slow, we really have to play the long game here. So next slide. So what we suggest is what many states have done, and they've made good progress, by having a bipartisan and diverse cadre of leaders from multiple sectors come together as an independent statewide commission or task force to make a long-term plan and guide the redesign of the education system. We would like to think that the work we've done and the recommendations we're making could help guide that group, but it's a group like that that would have the responsibility for building this education plan in a New Mexico way. Now, obviously, this is not a new idea in New Mexico. Most New Mexico stakeholders we interviewed, and we interviewed about almost 100 people, as you can see in the appendix to the report we gave you. Most New Mexicans believe that a broad array of people should be involved in guiding education improvement. And in the 2019 and 2020 sessions, as you all know, a bill was introduced that would create a commission on equity and excellence in education to address long-term strategies to improve New Mexico public education. It was not acted on, but as my understanding is things can come up over and over again in the legislature. So next slide. So our recommendation here is both a short and long-term step. It's something that could be initiated right away and proceed through longer than one governor's term. And the group could identify ways to strengthen these 5 essential elements of high-performing systems that we talked about. And it can also help build an accountability system that provides the right balance of state direction and local control and capacity. In other words, to bring improvement in ways that take New Mexico's uniqueness into account. Now, this is a relatively low-cost strategy with a long-term payoff. It can result in proposals that are substantively strong and politically viable, as well as having a coherence that's very difficult when we try to reform a system one statute at a time or one regulation at a time. It also has the potential of avoiding expensive, drawn-out court battles. In fact, in North Carolina this year, they have a case that's not unlike the Martinez-Yazzie case, called the Leandro case, and their case is 25 years old. And the plaintiffs in the state have never been able to come to agreement about what needs to be done. Well, this year, and I know about this because LPI was involved in the research, doing a report somewhat like this for North Carolina. But the governor also appointed a very diverse commission with experts in the areas of the education system that needed improvement, but also with thought leaders, influentials, business leaders, and they really came with an agenda to move North Carolina toward what the judge had ruled was a sufficient education in the state. They just signed a settlement. Now we'll see what happens next, but it is one of an example of what a commission can help a state accomplish when it's very difficult to do it without it. So if you put up the next slide, I want to just show again these 4 big findings. Essentially, that's the end of our presentation, and we really welcome questions, comments, speeches, whatever it is you would like to share with us or each other.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I don't have anyone on my list and no one is on chat.
So, Madam Chair, I think that means it's back to you.
Right. So what we would like to do is hopefully ask you to allow folks in here and online to communicate with you directly if a question comes up. I didn't hear that.
The sound must be off again.
Ay, Dios.
I think the chair needs to unmute herself.
Okay, let me try. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying that we don't have any questions online or in the chamber, but I would ask you to indulge us, and if we have members who happen to find out that they have questions after the fact, may they communicate with you directly. Okay. Well, we thank you for that great presentation. I know we have a lot of reading to do based on the thick booklet that you sent us. So we'll be reading that and we'll be in touch with you. Thank you so much, and you have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is... Okay, well, we have a 5-minute break.
That was weird. No questions. No questions.
Well, mute your phones, please.
Oh. I gotta go get water.
Okay, just checking. How long, and this one's what? How long is it gonna last? 2:30 to 4?
Yeah.
But you've given leeway for questions if they, okay,
So they're gonna go for about 15 minutes each.
okay. Okay. Good luck. I don't think anybody has the animus today.
Denver? Yeah, I think we could probably start now and see if you can ask Jen. She's able to reach Lewis. She logged in without sound? Okay.
Do you want me to your last name?
Is that Lisa?
I'm sorry, what's your last name? When did I've been calling, you you never answered me. I've been calling you Tim for 2 years.
Jim? You've been calling him Jim? It is Jim.
Oh, you said your name was Jen.
No, Jen is.
Oh, the presenter.
But then I wasn't 40 years, I was going to stay for years.
The man.
But you're gonna start the presentation.
I'm not doing that.
Oh, you're not?
I'm gonna be running PowerPoint stuff.
Oh, okay. So let me go ahead and get started. It is a day of like weird communication all the way around.
Hey, Chelsea. Chelsea.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are on for the next item on the agenda. And we have statewide education and telehealth networks, and our speakers are Jen Leisure, president of the Quilt, Ray Timothy, executive director of Utah Education and Telehealth Network, and Louis Fox, president and CEO, Corporation for Education Initiatives in California. And we'll go ahead and start with Jen.
All right, very good. Thank you so much for having us this afternoon. I wanted to make sure Louis Fox was able to join us too before we got started. I didn't see him on the screen yet. I do see Ray. Hello, Ray. Would it be all right if we wait until Louis is able to join us?
We can wait 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you.
There are full moon, maybe that's how and the moon. It's something.
ears and he moved them, the rabbit ears. Oh yeah, I can remember as a kid having one of those old school dials that had one that was a 13 or 14. And you could see one, you had some UPs or some channels that weren't channels that had something different. And mom and dad wanted the channel changed, and then you get up and yard to it. One was some pretty much used after church.
Tim, while we're waiting for Louis to join, will you be able to queue up the slides?
I think that was pretty much, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Jen will be able to do that.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, very good. Well, if it's all right with you, we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully Louis will be joining us here momentarily.
Okay.
All right, very good. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jen Leisure, president of the Quilt. I'm coming to you from Seattle, Washington today. And I want to thank you so much for the invitation to join your meeting and share information about state education networks with you. New Mexico holds a special place in my heart since I'm a graduate of the University of New Mexico. Tim, if I can get you to go ahead and advance.
It's on slide 2.
Hey, Jen, I've got it on slide 2 here. Do you want it on the next slide?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. I apologize. My ironically, we're talking about technology, right? My screen froze. Hopefully you were able to hear my introductory remarks. Research and education networks are an important part of our country's broadband landscape. It's our challenge today to introduce you to our country's research and education networking community, as well as give you an opportunity to hear from 2 key leaders of our community about their missions, their networks, the communities that each of them serve, and in a very short amount of time. I am joined today by Ray Timothy, Executive Director of the Utah Education and Telehealth Network, and Louis Fox, who is President and CEO of CNIC, the statewide research and education network in California. Hopefully Louis has joined us. I'm going to keep my introduction of the Quilt and our state research and education network members brief, as you're going to want to spend as much time today as possible with Louis and Ray, learning from them about the information that they have prepared for you. So here's a roadmap. If you can go back, Tim, here's a roadmap of where we're going to head today. I'm going to talk about the Quilt, give you an overview of the Quilt, our members, talk to you a little bit about the New Mexico Albuquerque Gigapop, talk to you some about, give you a preview of the profiles of our RNE network members, and then let Louis and Ray be able to present to you about their organizations. So go ahead, next slide. I often get asked where the Quilt gets its name from, and I thought it would be helpful to start our conversation today by sharing the origin of our name. Our background provides, this background about our name provides good insight into the spirit of our collective work as the Quilt formed, and the spirit is still alive today and very evident in the collaborative work that we do together across the country. Next slide. I wanted to give you a sense of our Quilt members and the work that they do. So we have 38 RNE networks nationwide that are members of the Quilt. We have 10 affiliates that include some international research and education networks. Our Quilt members connect over 900 higher education institutions across the country and connect tens of thousands of community anchor institutions. What I mean by community anchor institutions are just those institutions that you think of, the K through 12 schools, public libraries, public health, research centers, basically public service institutions. The Quilt itself is a nonprofit corporation, a 501c3, You can see our mission here, and I'm very pleased to let you know we are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. Next slide. We have 3 strategic visions that support our Quilt mission. And the first is we aim to support the missions of regional R&E networks as critical infrastructure to advance the U.S.'s scientific discovery, education, cultural knowledge, healthcare, and public service. As you will learn from Lewis and Ray, an R&E network has many facets to it, and we all know the pace that technology evolves in is astounding. And our Quilt community is an asset to all of our members that allows them to tap into technical expertise with other organizations, fellow member organizations, that as we work together, we're able to collectively advance our missions. Our second area of work that the Quilt works in is we do all of this and underpin the missions of our Quilt members by delivering a collaborative environment for our member networks to engage with one another. And third, our networks have a number of federal partners that include the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, the NTIA, and others. Our Quilt members also participate in our National Universal Service Fund programs, like the FCC's E-rate program, the Healthcare Connect Fund. And an important aspect of what the Quilt does is we serve as a communication point for these important partners on behalf of our Quilt members, our entire national community. As well as we inform and educate to these partners about our members and local institutions and the impact that these programs have on the work that we do as R&E networks. So this is a very high-level overview of the Quilt. I'm next going to walk through our member organizations. So what you see here on the slide is a breakdown of the different vertical communities that Research and Education Networks serve. R&E networks provide unparalleled levels of network performance, network resiliency, and network security to the communities that they connect. R&E networks, and I'm going to use R&E networks, short for Research and Education Networks. R&E networks have been designed to meet the needs of some of the most demanding internet users in the country, scientists, academics, and researchers in our nation's leading academic institutions. Over time, many of our research and education networks have expanded to provide broadband services to these different vertical communities that you see here: schools, libraries, state and local governments, nonprofit healthcare, other nonprofit entities that are engaged in education and educational initiatives. Each community segment has unique service and application requirements, as you can imagine. But by working with research and education networks, these anchor institutions are able to aggregate within specific geographic areas to efficiently and cost-effectively make use of these networks and the essential applications that require high broadband speeds. This R&E network infrastructure provides an on-net statewide infrastructure that connects local institutions to one another, as well as connecting these institutions to multi-state networks, national networks, and global research and education networks. Participants and member institutions enjoy reduced costs for the entirety of their services due to the shared expertise in services and increased buying power and economies of scale that participants get from being part of a larger R&E networking community. When you talk to research and education networks, you'll hear us often talk about our member community. For any connected institution, they become a community member. R&E organizations invest significant energy into fostering community forums to regularly share technical and operational information and build a fabric of trust among our community members. So all of our Quilt members are nonprofit entities, and I'll get into that a little bit more later in my presentation. Next slide, please. So this is our family photo, if you will. It gives you a sense of the breadth of different research and education networks. They're intra-state networks. You'll see those, we kind of call those the constellations. These are within a state. You see some of the lighter, fainter lines that show those intra-state infrastructure. And then in the colored lines, you see the interconnections among our U.S. research and education networks. So this gives you a sense of the statewide research and education networks. These research and education networks also connect into our National Research and Education Network, which is the Internet 2 Research and Education Network. that connects all of these institutions by state and then nationally. So this map gives you a sense of the impressive infrastructure each of these organizations operate to pursue their research and education networking missions. And Louis and Ray will share more details about their networks in their overviews. Next slide, please. Since you are interested in more information about statewide education networks, I want to include information in this presentation about our quilt member in New Mexico called the Albuquerque Gigapop. I won't go into too much detail as I expect this committee is already familiar with the Albuquerque Gigapop, or ABQG, out of the University of New Mexico, and the Albuquerque Gigapop statewide backbone. But I do want to put into context today about how this resource in your state relates to other members of our national community, like SCENIC and like the Utah Education and Telehealth Network. Next slide, please. I know you're familiar with the work of the Albuquerque Gigapop, but as a refresher, here is a network map of their statewide backbone. And the connected organizations and institutions are listed there on the left. As you look at this backbone, you'll see two blue arrows, one that is right at the north of the map on the right-hand side, and then one that is pointing west at the south end of that map. These indicate how the Albuquerque Gigapop connects into a Western State Research and Education Network fabric that you'll hear about a little later as well. Next slide, please. This map here takes those blue arrows that I just showed you and gives you a little more insight as how these connect into the Western State Research and Education collaboration. The Western State Regional Network, or WRN, is a collaboration of Pacific Wave. This is hosted by SCENIC and also another one of our quilt members headquartered out of Washington State, here where I am, the Pacific Northwest Gigapop. The Albuquerque Gigapop is a member of Pacific Wave, and this provides institutions that are connected to the Albuquerque Gigapop access to key internet exchange points on the global internet. Louis will be providing some more information about the Western Regional Network in his remarks. Next slide, please. So every year, the Quilt puts together a compilation of stories about our Quilt members and the work that they do, the work that they've enabled with their community partners in their states. So if you have access to these slides, Tim, these are hyperlinks in here. And I've also included the link to our online digital version of this publication. Once you open it, you'll see our largest compilation yet for 2020 of the examples that our Quilt members play as key enablers of projects and programs that are assisting the missions of their anchor institutions that each serve. Naturally, the Quilt is very proud of the key role that our member networks play in serving their communities. So this annual publication gives us a chance to showcase the work of our members across the country into a single collection. Like the Quilt itself, we believe that the single collection of examples of our member missions in action are more powerful than the sum of its parts. So I hope that you'll have a chance to look at this and dive in a little bit deeper after our presentation today. Next slide, please. So in this last slide, I wanted to spend some time talking about the profiles of our Quilt members. We have 38 Quilt members and 40, including a couple of our affiliates that are US-based entities. And while all of them have a similar mission, they also have differences in their organizations that are derived from the local influences and issues that frame the way that each of these networks operate. Since these organizations are closer and work very closely with their end constituents, they're influenced more directly by the local and state issues, policies, and programs. And these are reflected in the organization's own governance structures, business structures, service offerings, and partnerships. About a third of our Quilt members are independent 501c3 corporations like the Quilt. Another third are university-based organizations, such as the Albuquerque Gigapop. And the remaining third are state operated under state entities, and I'll give you a few examples of that. Some of them are governed by State Board of Regents. We have another quilt member that's governed by a Council of Post-Secondary Education at the state level. Others work within the state IT or Department of Finance, another division of state government. So you saw in one of my earlier slides the different vertical communities that are served by the research and education networks. All of our quilt members connect higher education, and as I mentioned earlier, many connect other community anchor institutions in those different verticals. Community colleges, K through 12 schools, public libraries, research centers, and other public service institutions. Based on the business models of our quilt members, the research and education networks, that influences the governance models for each of these organizations. And the independent nonprofit corporations are governed by a board of directors, as you would expect with a corporation. University-based organizations are typically governed by some type of advisory group, and the same for state-led organizations, that they're also governed by some type of council or advisory group. But what all of these governance structures have in common, regardless of the different business structure, and this is what really makes R&E Networks unique, is that we are all governed by our users. Those that use the infrastructure and services have a direct input and say into how the resources of the organization are prioritized to meet the needs of the users, and it's all done in a very transparent way. There are a few of the research and education networks that receive state appropriation, but the primary revenue sources for most of the R&E networks is through a cost recovery model that charges the individual member institutions for the services that they receive. And lastly, I want to talk to you about partnerships. This is another area that really makes research and education networks special. As mission-driven organizations, R&E networks are uniquely positioned to forge long-lasting and successful academic, research, governmental, and industry partnerships. R&E networks are able to successfully partner with a wide range of entities, and this includes commercial telecommunications carriers, rural telephone cooperatives, rural electric cooperatives, state departments of transportation, tribal governments, and others to expand broadband access to unserved and underserved areas of their state. R&E networks, because of the unique position they play in the broadband landscapes, really are able to serve an important convener and trusted partner role in the broadband landscapes and helping bring access and bridging the broadband gaps in their different geographies. So I know I moved for that very quickly. Be glad to take questions at the end. But as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to leave as much time as possible for you to learn from Ray and Lewis about their organizations. I'll let them take it over from here. And Tim, since you're driving, I think the Utah Education and Telehealth Network slides come next. So we'll turn it over to Ray Timothy. Ray?
Okay, thank you, Jan. Members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Tim, I wondered if I would be able to share my own screen, as I might jump back and forth between slides. Is that doable?
Is that a yes?
It's shadowed out.
Ray, I stopped sharing my screen, and we're going to go ahead and make you the presenter here so you can share yours.
Oh, all right, thank you. Okay, it's really a pleasure for me to be here with you today. Anytime I can work with Jan, it's always a pleasure. She does a great job and has done a great job explaining what the quilt is and what each of the individual members do collectively. What I'd like to focus on is specifically what we do as a network within the state of Utah. My name is Ray Timothy. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Utah Education and Telehealth Network. We actually were created in the mid-1950s as an educational television station. We would broadcast content out over the airwaves, and schools would pick up the signal and then watch those courses within the classroom. And that was way back in the 1950s. As the technology has evolved and developed, we were also then given the responsibility to provide networking services and that. And so this is this first slide that I have for you, I put there so that you can reference back to it, but this is actually Utah code. And this shows you where we were created and where we're at. We're in Chapter 17 of Utah Code in the higher education area, specifically under the University of Utah. And the reason why we're under the University of Utah is because that's where we were created again as that educational television station. We still continue to broadcast. We still have our television station with 4 individual channels. And so we still continue to send out signal and programming throughout the state. In part 1 here of the telecommunications section of Chapter 17, it describes who we are and what we do. That we provide the public television services. We are also responsible for the telecommunications needs of our stakeholders. As we get down here, Section 105 is the one that's more telling of what it is that we do. That we provide support those telecommunication needs of public and higher ed, public libraries, and also telehealth. Further down, it also talks about our board. We didn't have a board until about 6 years ago. We did have an advisory group, but we now have a board that has the ability to write state rules, and it describes the membership of the board. We have 13 members. They represent all of our stakeholders: higher ed, public ed, libraries, etc. And it talks about who appoints them to our board and who they are responsible to report back to. And then down below in Section 7 here, it gives my role and responsibility of what it is that I'm supposed to do as the executive director. Well, let's see. All right, so I'd like to share with you at this time a brief video clip that describes this in a little more detail.
When a Utah 5th grader turns on a computer and learns about history, who makes it possible? When a patient at a rural healthcare clinic needs an exam from a specialist in another community, who makes it possible? Or when a university researcher crunches worldwide data or meets with colleagues from around the state via video conference, who makes that possible? The answer is UEN, the Utah Education Network, and UTN, the Utah Telehealth Network. We're a team of people and technology that makes education and healthcare more accessible to people throughout Utah. And best of all, because of our work, Utah saves millions of dollars every year, thanks to increased efficiency. Our partnership does 3 big things: network services, application services, and support services. Let's take a look at what all that means. First up, network services. We build and maintain the state's broadband network for education and telehealth, and we partner with local telecommunications companies to extend access to schools, universities, libraries, clinics, and hospitals throughout Utah. We also run routers, bridges, and security systems to manage all that traffic so it's reliable and fast. Next, there's application services. We listen to the priorities of public and higher education and healthcare. Then we work to deliver the learning content students, faculty, and providers need, licensed from others or built in-house, such as tools to search the state's curriculum. We've also brought many premium library databases together in one place online, so students in Blanding can do their homework with the same online research tools as students in Bountiful, saving $4.5 million in the process. Working with partners across the nation, we've gathered a robust, searchable collection of award-winning videos, lesson plans, and applications that teachers visit more than 1 million times a month. And finally, support services. We want to get the most bang for every technology buck. So in every corner of the state, we provide technology support, training, and troubleshooting. Need help getting access to a library of videos about biology? We're here to help. Seeking to explore new ways to manage diabetes or asthma? We'll make it happen. Need to make sure your school is filtering out certain websites? We'll set it up. Looking to meet with others to learn new software? We'll bring you together. Need to hold a workshop to help teachers learn the latest technology? We do that too. So that's UEN and UTN in a nutshell. We network for education and healthcare, bringing people and technology together to help make Utah the best place to live and learn, no matter who or where you are. Thanks for getting to know us. Learn more at uitn.org.
Okay, so whom do we serve? As stated, we serve K-12. All public schools are connected to the network through us. All of our higher education institutions, colleges and universities. We also support our public libraries. We connect about 95% of our public libraries to the network. And our technical colleges also. And on top of that, we also do healthcare, provide services for hospitals and clinics, over 70 throughout the state of Utah. So those are our stakeholders. That's where our focus is, and that's who we serve. This is the infrastructure map. Just a minute, I need to get rid of my picture here, if I can. Move it out of the way. There we go. Now, this is our infrastructure map. You can see all of the white circles. Those are our healthcare facilities that we connect. Again, hospitals, clinics, healthcare providers of various sorts. The different colored lines, this is our backbone. The different colors represent the different bandwidth for each of those circuits. The red one is 100 gig, and we're in the process, even though it shows less capacity going to the other circuits, we're in the process of upgrading our entire backbone up to 100 gig backbone. And we're also in the beginning stages of discussion because of the utilization that we see of our network. We're in the discussion now of when do we convert to 400 gig backbone. Okay, let's see. This shows our funding source. Jen mentioned that most of the Quilt members bill back for services provided. We don't do that. We don't charge our members for joining our network and the services that we provide. In rare examples, we do if they ask us to go above and beyond what the normal services are. But if you look down here on the bottom where it says the total, right here, our budget is about $53 million. And of that $53 million, the state appropriation is about $33 million. And then again, we're a television station, KUEN TV, and we receive a grant from the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, and that's usually between $4 to $6 million each year. And then Jen mentioned about the E-rate program, and I don't know how familiar you are with that, but that allows us to work with the FCC on these telecommunication projects that we do to have a discounted rate of what the cost of the projects are. And so we're able to, when we do some kind of a project where we take circuits out and connect to new facilities, new schools, we're able to apply and receive a discount. Now, we're the state consortium filer, so we file on behalf of all of our schools and libraries, and we receive, on average, a 70% discount. So that means that for every dollar that we spend on a project, we receive 70 cents back. So that money that we get back, that's what we apply towards the circuit costs, and that's why we don't have to charge any of our schools or higher ed institutions or to connect to our network. And then other funding sources, we do have some private schools. The Catholic education system has contracted with us to have their internet connectivity through our network, and also some private colleges. And so we do bill back for those services that we provide them for costs. The services that we provide to our customers, it shows again down here at the bottom, 53 million. And about 30 million of that, a little over 30 million, goes to services that we provide to public education. Higher education receives about 14 million worth of services, and our other customers, those private institutions. We also provide support quite regularly to our governor's office and also to our legislature. We're not the main support for them, but we were called in to help with we had 6 special sessions just this last year, and because of the pandemic. And so we were called in to provide those networking capabilities so that they could do their legislative sessions virtually. And the very first one started out with only the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House at the state capitol with a handful of staff members for support. All other legislators were in their homes and connected, and we did a virtual legislative session. We've evolved now where we can do both at home or face to face at the Capitol at this point. But it shows again what those about 15% goes to provide service for other groups. This is the same data, just in a different format. If you prefer pie charts to look at the data, it starts out, the wide area network takes the bulk of what our roles is, and work our way down to the other stakeholders that we work with. And then how much of our budget is spent by our customers. Again, public ed receives the lion's share, then higher ed, and all the way down. But same data as the other charts, just a different format to look at. Well, back to our infrastructure map, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about the fact that, we say this is our network, and it is, but we do not own the fiber. We lease the fiber from telecommunication companies, and that's actually in state statute that we are supposed to not compete with private enterprise. And so we engineer the network. We know what it is that we need. We know how much usage there is of the network and how much bandwidth we need to have. And we focus on providing all of that so that our stakeholders don't have to worry if they have adequate bandwidth. They do what they do best. They teach, they provide good health care, and we worry about making sure that they have a good operating network. We go through that process of designing the network, and we put together an RFP. We put that RFP out, and then the telcos sharpen their pencils. They go through a very competitive bidding process, and then they submit their bids on that, and then we're able to review all of that and determine who the best carrier would be to provide those services. So it's a win-win situation. It's a public-private partnership. And the one thing that they benefit from and why they like working with us this way is because let's take this circuit over here that goes from Vernal all the way down to Blanding. They're the population, that's not a high populous area in our state. And so the incentive for a telecommunication company to want to go out there and lay fiber and try to provide services, they're just not going to get a return on their investment. But we have schools along there that we need to connect. So we work with the E-rate program. We put together the application. And again, we're able to get a discount on what the actual cost of putting that circuit would be. And so, again, we get 70 cents back for every dollar that we would spend in doing that. So they come in, and when we've awarded the contract, that carrier would come in, and they would trench all the way down and lay the fiber that we need for the schools that we're connecting. But while they're laying the fiber for us and the trench is still open, they throw in additional fiber for their own use. they cost allocate that out so that it's not, we're not using E-rate dollars to pay for what they want to do. But we become the anchor tenant in this community and provide the services for those schools. We pay that monthly circuit cost. And so it takes about 3 years, and the telco will receive a return on their investment after 3 years. We always enter into 5-year contracts, so those final 2 years of the contract, that's their profit years. But while they're making, they're getting their costs paid for through us and what we do, they're also, they've got their own fiber, and so they're able to reach out into the community and provide connectivity to the homes or connectivity to businesses. So that's where I say it's the win-win. We win because we're able to get someone to come in and lay that fiber for us. They win because they can throw in additional strands, and then they can also serve the community in other ways. So it's proven to be a very effective model. One other thing that if you notice up in the northeast corner there, you see dotted lines in Daggett County, and you also see down in the Four Corners area where you're familiar down there, dotted lines. And what the dotted lines mean is that it's not fiber. Those are areas of the state that have not yet been connected. And so we're using microwave to provide those services. And microwave has been adequate, but it's not as good as having fiber. And so we continue to work with the FCC and getting E-rate dollars to be able to help us with that. And I can report to you that up in Daggett, 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the completion of this portion of the network. We went from Vernal all the way up through Flaming Gorge to Flaming Gorge Elementary. And this is where Flaming Gorge Dam is. And we had to take fiber through the interior of the dam, come out the other side, and then move on to the elementary school. And so we worked with the Bureau of Reclamation for that. We also worked with our Department of Transportation. They want to have cameras on every aspect of the roads throughout the entire state, so they can monitor the weather, they can make sure that all of the traffic needs are taken care of. So they partnered with us. The Forest Service partnered with us. The local school district, the local healthcare clinics, the hospital that has a clinic up in Manila. So this is a 70-mile stretch that we went up to Manila High School, and we celebrated the completion last week or 2 weeks ago. And then down in that Four Corners area, we come down. We had this was that green circuit that I showed you. It comes down to Blanding. But from Blanding, we used microwave to connect all of the other schools down there. Well, at this point, we've received approval to divide this into 2 phases. Phase 1 goes from Blanding down to Bluff and then over to Montezuma Creek. The Monday that we celebrated the Daggett project's completion, we started construction on Phase 1 from Blanding to Montezuma Creek. And that is going to be completed by the end of this October, this next month. So that is a very quick build to be able to get Phase 1 completed. And that was about $6 million full cost to run that. The other part, Phase 2 from Bluff, Mexican Hat, Monument Valley over at Navajo Mountain, some of the most rugged terrain that you would ever see. Most remote areas in the country again. And Phase 2, the difficulty of both phases has been getting all of the right-of-ways, getting all of the permits signed so that we can cross over tribal territory or tribal lands. And so while we're still working to complete the Phase 1, we're working to get those waivers so that we can cross the tribal lands again. But that's who we are. That's what we do. And I'm open to any questions if you have any at this time.
I thought we had another presenter.
Okay. Yes. Okay. I'll wait.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Tim, do you have Louis Fox's slides available to you?
Yes, he has them and he'll put them up now.
Sounds good. Thanks. Very good, Louis. We're going to turn it over to you.
Louis, if you hear me, please unmute your mic. Can someone text him to unmute his mic?
Yeah, I will give him a quick text here. He is shaking that he doesn't have the ability to do that. Is someone that has the admin rights able to unmute him?
We haven't been able to, otherwise she would have.
Okay, Louis, it looks like you're unmuted now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Here we go.
I started to, it's always great to hear what Ray is doing in Utah, particularly how really adept they are in Utah at reaching rural areas. I'm envious. I wish we could have as many successful rural projects as you do in Utah. In any case, I'm Louis Fox. I'm the president and CEO of CENIC. CENIC is the Research and Education Network for California. You can go on to the next slide, please. So I did send, I sent you, in addition to the PowerPoint, a sort of redacted overview that we use for new board members that gives you in considerable detail information about CENIC. So I will more or less skim over the top. We were founded in 1997, initially by the University of California, Stanford, Caltech, and USC, along with Cal State University system. They were, this is largely towards the end of the privatization of the NSF-Net, when each of these entities set up their own networks and they decided to consolidate into a single network. Very soon thereafter, they were joined by the California Community Colleges in the early 2000s by public K-12 schools, and over the last 6 years, we have brought on our California Public Libraries. Next slide, please. I may have a bit of delay because in addition to living in California, I actually have a ranch in Montana. I'm on a satellite connection, so there's 48,000 miles between me and you for this signal. Are you looking at a map now? Okay, good. So we have just some of the numbers. We run a backbone network just like Tim does in Utah. It's roughly 8,000 miles of long-haul optical fiber that we have on 20-year IRUs. We also either have IRUs or outright own considerable amount of metro fibers in our major metropolitan areas. We direct connect to our research universities, to the Cal State University system, and increasingly we have dark fiber connections to large community college districts, the LA Public Library, some of the larger school districts like LA Unified, San Francisco, and so on. We have members in all 58 counties of California, and about 12,000 sites connect to Scenic. And we estimate about half of California, 20 million Californians are on our network. We were formed as a not-for-profit organization, and we're governed by our members. So it's a bit like, and each segment appoints the representatives to the board. It's a little bit like Noah's Ark, but instead of coming 2 by 2, they come 3 by 3. So the president of the University of California appoints 3 board members. The chancellor of California State University appoints 3 members. The state superintendent 3 members, and so on. We work with anywhere from 800 to 1,000 different private sector partners. While we direct connect with own fiber to research universities to get to most of the 12,000 sites, we do that via lease circuits from carriers, and so we work with every carrier in California, from the large incumbents to the mom and pop CLECs, cable companies, fixed wireless providers, whoever it is that can provide us access. Similar to Tim, we run an E-rate consortium. So we get subsidized circuits for our K-12 schools and for our libraries. In addition, the California Public Utility Commission has an analogous fund called the California Teleconnect Fund. And so we access that fund on behalf of our K-12 members, libraries, and community colleges. And then we do a bit of work. We have 7 large university medical centers and multiple hospitals that are on our network, along with non-charter associates. That is, they don't have a governance role, but we connect a lot of other healthcare institutions and are increasingly helping them with their telehealth efforts with other hospitals, with rural clinics, and with school-based programs. Next slide, please. We received questions from you, and I think I've tried to answer everything that you asked. One of the things I would point out is the defining aspect of our network is our research capacity. We're working with numerous leading-edge research organizations, and they need to have sort of be pre-positioned to continue to be successful in their scientific research and other research and their clinical activity and so on. And it also distinguishes us from a common carrier. So we talk a lot about our research mission. We are enabled now at 400 gig across our backbone for those institutions. But we also have the other side of the coin is our broadband equity mission. And so we want to ensure that all community anchor institutions have access to very robust broadband. And as it turns out, some of the research capacity and research services that we begin with, serving UC Berkeley or Caltech or Stanford, ends up redounding to the benefit of other members. So when we set up a new security service for our research universities, often we're able to replicate that and offer that kind of service to our other members. So it's a really interesting symbiosis. I don't think it would be possible to run a network on our scale if we hadn't broadened the base, if it was just a research network. I think it would be unaffordable. Next slide, please. The funding for the network comes from each segment. So the University of California, California State University, public libraries, state superintendent, they all pay an annual common backbone fee. How they budget for it differs. So for instance, the public libraries actually get a state appropriation that goes to them, and from their aggregator. We have aggregators in each world. And UC, it's the Office of the President. At CSU, it's the Chancellor's Office. For public libraries, it's the State Library. And then they're the ones who contribute that amount. All the segments pay equal amounts. We have the private institutions pay a pro rata share that was established 20 years ago. With those funds, we provide all of the network services that we do, and I'll talk about those in a moment. We did one thing that we were able to keep the backbone fee constant for almost 15 years. In this last upgrade of the network, and now that we've added 1,000 public libraries, we had to go back and say, well, look, we need some additional resources. So we added a 3% annual increase that is largely tied to the consumer price index. We have a circuit deployment fee. We might do as many as 700 or 800 circuit deployments in a year. And they're very complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. It's not just Scenic and the entity. We're working with a commercial vendor. We have to think about co-location spaces and power and so on and so forth. So it's a very labor-intensive effort. And so we have a flat fee for each circuit deployment. And we added, our budget runs about between $100 and $120 million a year. And 50 to 60% of that is passed through. That is, we'll procure a circuit and then get the subsidy, and the entity only pays us, that pass-through amount. We added a slight overhead charge to that of 7.2%, because it is indeed real work. It takes a tremendous amount of energy of the staff, and it is directly proportional to the requests for circuits or circuit upgrades. As I said, we work with a lot of private sector partners. A lot of the upgrades that we do, or extensions of the network, we tend to do either with funds from the California Advanced Services Fund, which is run by the Public Utility Commission, or with federal funds, or with a commercial partner, where basically we work with them and the communities that the new fiber is going to go to, and we bring the customers to them, whether they're K-12 or libraries or community college satellite sites or healthcare. Next slide, please. You asked about relationships and partners. We, as I mentioned, we work with every telecommunications provider in California. We have very great relationships with them. We've worked very hard on this. And because of the number of circuits that we provision, and because we do the aggregation for them, we get incredibly preferential pricing from particularly the large incumbents, but also the cable companies and even some of the smaller companies. We work with, additionally, with all the big companies that build fiber, metro fiber and long haul fiber. And one key thing that we provide, so let's say you're at a community college and you connect to Scenic. You connect into Scenic and you get a sort of a panoply of services. You have this large backbone going to all the community anchor institutions in California. You connect to all the other research and education networks in the U.S. and abroad. You get, if your back office services are in the cloud at Amazon or Google, we peer with those networks. We do what's called settlement-free peering, and that means that our network is large enough that it's beneficial to content providers, cloud providers, and other networks to exchange traffic with us for free. And so we have about 100 peers, which means that most of the traffic that's not research traffic, 85% of the rest of the traffic is handed off to settlement-free peers. And we buy ISP services for about 15% of the traffic. Our member institutions use all those services. They don't have to pay separately for the ISP services. They connect to our network, they get our peers, they get our ISP, they get all the other networks that we connect to. I mentioned the California Public Utilities Commission. They're a key partner in what we do because they also have a mission for broadband access, equity, and affordability. That dovetails nicely with what we do. There is another entity that was formed by the Public Utility Commission called the California Emerging Technology Foundation. They focus mostly on issues of adoption and affordability in un- and underserved communities. They're a key partner of ours. And then California, the legislature in California, through the Public Utility Commission, funds 19 community broadband consortia in geographic regions of the state. So, for instance, in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, very large counties, there's an Inland Empire broadband consortium. And so we work with all the consortia. We have 115 federally recognized tribes in California. And increasingly, we have partnerships with a number of them. We started with a major project with 20 tribes in Southern California, and now we have an analogous project going on in Northern California. So, next slide, please. That's a map of our backbone network, but I wanted you to also see that we have an extended footprint that goes well beyond California. And we're involved with partners, 2 other networks. The one that would be probably most important to all of you is the Western Regional Network. And that's a partnership among Scenic, the Pacific Northwest Gigapop, which serves the Northwest, the University of Hawaii, the Front Range Gigapop, which is Colorado and Wyoming, the Albuquerque Gigapop, which is near and dear to you, and now Link Oregon, which is the Oregon network. Pacific Northwest Gigapop also connects Alaska, Montana, and some portions of Idaho. This has largely been used as a research network, but some of the WRN members access other services through Scenic, whether it's ISP services or peering. We also run, on behalf of all the research universities in the United States, a project called Pacific Wave, which is an international peering fabric. So all the networks that come ashore on the West Coast from Asia Pacific that interconnect with us, we then support any research university that needs to peer with those networks anywhere in the United States. We have a point of presence in Chicago now where we connect to European networks, and we recently built an express route with Internet 2 that reaches the international exchanges in New York and Washington, in the Washington D.C. area. So we've tried to sort of knit together a global fabric of research networks. Next slide, please. I mentioned our library initiative. As I said, equity is a huge part of what we do. We, through our K-12 members and through the California Department of Education, received $76 million over 3 years to do work on connecting the least well-connected K-12 schools. We have a similar project on a smaller scale going on this year. We have in California roughly 10,000 connected K-12 schools. I mentioned the Tribal Digital Village. Next slide. We have a significant initiative underway with UC Davis Center for Health and Technology. The UC Davis Medical Center serves a lot of Northern California through partnerships with rural and tribal clinics, school-based clinics, and hospitals. And we are piloting what we're calling the electronic health platform with them, using our broad network, all of the global peering points that we're in, to provide a singular platform that healthcare participants can use for their electronic health records, for diagnostic services, for insurance and billing, and for back office applications, using their existing connections to Scenic rather than having to build separate connections for each of those kinds of services. We work with city and state government. Largely, we peer with their networks. So Los Angeles and San Francisco have significant open data efforts, and they have research partnerships. And by peering with us, they can move massive amounts of data to their research partners without having to transit the commercial internet. We also work with a state network who have a data center, and it's a multi-tenant data center cloud service that is accessible to any state-funded entity without having to do an RFP. And so we interconnect with the state of California's network. We also are working on a number of municipal fiber sharing efforts where we would provide access to our backbone, potentially technical expertise in return for getting access to fiber pair or fiber pairs. And lastly, we have been working on a fairly ambitious project to instrument through fixed wireless the mountaintops of California with, if you turn to the next slide, pleet with a variety of cameras, weather sensing instruments, et cetera, that are done via fixed wireless that allow immediate access and understanding, situational awareness of fires, but we're also instrumenting with earthquake and landslide and other kinds of instruments. We have a proposal to the California state government, as I said. Next slide, please. to scale this up statewide. It is it's in existence now in a large swath of Southern California, around Lake Tahoe and in a few other areas. But it's been a tremendous asset for first responders. It has been, next slide, please. It now ties into a project of the San Diego Supercomputing Center that takes data from these cameras and weather sensors and so on, from satellites, from airplanes that are flying over, from weather forecasts, from information about vegetation density, and it provides a predictive mapping for first responders. So if I'm a fire chief and I'm thinking about a fire, I have pretty immediate access to this data to understand, what the fire is currently doing, but also what it might do, because I can change the parameters. I can change the wind speed. I can change the wind direction. I can change the weather parameters and begin to anticipate what might change. As many of you know, the hardest thing with responses to these sorts of natural disasters is proportionality. If you underestimate, and I just had a fire come over the hill, we evacuated last week. If you underestimate, which happened here in Montana, the fire went from 20 acres to 10,000 acres overnight, underestimated. If you overestimate, you're taking resources that might need to be applied someplace else. And so this is very helpful in that proportionality. It also allows you to download information immediately from drones that are flying over, and all the kinds of modern tools that firefighters and others dealing with emergencies work with. So it's, as I said, it's an ambitious project. We sort of got derailed by the pandemic, and now we're back into, as you know, in California, pretty significant fire season that's just starting, with some of the largest fires ever in our history. So we hope to get back to this project. It is the San Diego Supercomputing Center's project is called WiFire, and they work very closely with county fire departments in San Diego County and Los Angeles County, a number of other adjacent counties, to do training, to do the monitoring, and to set up there. Next slide. I won't go through all the information about WiFire, but the one thing I'd note in this one, and this is from 2017 from the Tubbs fire in Sonoma County, that if we had had this kind of capacity in place to anticipate how the fire would spread, one, we would have been able to understand who to evacuate and how quickly to evacuate, how to attack the fire. We wouldn't have lost lives, and we would have lost only a fraction of the 10% of the structures that were lost during that fire. So it really is a critical asset for the state. PG&E, one of the big energy companies in California, has been working with our research community and with CNIC to at least implement many of the cameras in some of their territories. Next slide, please. We'll skip over there. You can see. I'll leave. You have an artifact now of what this is. Later in the slideshow, there's a map of the Pacific Wave peering infrastructure. This is something that University of New Mexico and whoever they connect on their backbone already has access to. And there's another slide that shows the Asia Pacific Research and Education Exchange, the fabric that connects the East and West Coasts. But the last slide on here, I didn't want to lose this one because we've we've made a concerted effort to connect arts, cultural, and scientific organizations to the scenic backbone, because the content that they create and the expertise that they have is important to both formal and informal education, to our universities, to our K-12, to our libraries. And so we have many of the largest arts, cultural, and scientific organizations in California, like SF Jazz, like the Getty, like the California Academy of Sciences, the Exploratorium, and so on, connected to our network. We do this at cost. And we try and find whatever subsidies we can for these organizations, because we believe that they have tremendous content and expertise that's very important to our members. And as it's turned out during the pandemic, has been actually cultural and scientific riches for our members to integrate into the kinds of learn from home efforts that they've stood up. And then with that, I'll leave that behind. As I said, I left you with a lot more detailed information as well. The last slide has my contact information and email and phone access.
Thank you so much, Louis and Ray, for the wealth of information. As I mentioned, it's really challenging to present an overview of the complex work that research and education networks do in their states. But you've got a really wonderful glance into that with Louis and Ray's information. I know that we have some time for some questions, so Tim, we'll turn it over to you and the committee members.
All right, thank you all so much for your presentation. We have on our list 2 questions. Senator Michael Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. This is one of my major swim lanes in my legislature, so thank you so much. This is really, really great information. I am doing a lot of work in this area, and we have a couple of big things we did in 2017. We have some big stuff we're going to try to do next year. But a question around, and you sort of mentioned this, I think, Mr. Fox, a little bit, on pricing. So we have districts that are very sparse and rural and just hard to get to. So in a lot of ways, we have districts that might be paying in the cents per meg, and then we have others that are paying $63 and $67 and $130 a meg, if you can believe it. So can you talk a little bit about bulk pricing agreements? How did that come to fruition in your areas, if you choose to comment on that? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. I mean, for us, we issue our RFPs, and as I said, we have agreements with a number of major carriers that set a common rate for urban or which has been tremendously helpful for the rural areas. And then, as I said, we also go in with our base ask for these is a gigabit symmetrical for. And there are some areas in California, particularly in the Northwest and the Northeast and the desert South, where there isn't a whole lot of installed infrastructure, so fiber. So in those cases, we've had to go and use largely fixed wireless, but we're still getting good pricing. We have a very excellent fixed wireless company in California. It's one of the fastest growing ISPs in the country. And they're able to provide us usually either 100 megabits symmetrical or 500 megabits symmetrical to those schools. I can't, the pricing, again, once the subsidy, and a lot of these schools are getting 90% subsidies, plus the other 50% of the remainder is covered by the California Teleconnect Fund, so they may only be paying 5 cents on the dollar. Or 10 cents, and so it does make it affordable for them. There are, there are some really hard to reach sites, and Ray is probably, one of our national experts on how you build out to those sites. So he should address this as well.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Louis. And Senator Padilla, thank you for the question. Again, we don't bill out to our schools because we use the savings we receive through the E-rate program to be able to cover those circuit costs. We do go through the RP process, as I mentioned earlier, but I think we end up getting some of the lowest prices in the entire nation.
And so, Madam Chair, and thank you both for your responses. With regard to governance, do the schools govern themselves on broadband, or do you participate in something that's for all state government, or do you know that how the governance works in each one of your locations? Because we're sort of wrestling with how do we handle governance if we try to drive some things consistently or through consistency with regard to broadband access and expansion here. How is governance handled in your states?
So our schools, we have 3 board members from K-12 that are appointed by the state superintendent. And so all of public K-12 is in effect a member of scenic. And so the trick here is that there are some local jurisdictions and school boards who opt not to participate. I would say we have in the high 80% of participation. We have 1,000 school districts. I would say that we probably have, close to 900 school districts that participate, but there still are some that don't. And, we reach out to them. We try and talk with them about the value of joining scenic, but, some of them have long-term relationships with a mom and pop telco that provides them service, and they really are not able to distinguish between just basic internet service and the value of being on a network like us. So it's a problem that even after 20 years of participation with K-12, we continue to chip away at. If you have some, Senator, if you have some suggestions, we are definitely all ears.
We're learning ourselves right now. Mr. Timothy, yes.
Yes, 100% of our schools are connected through us. We're responsible to get the fiber to the door, and then the school districts themselves are responsible for everything that's within the building. And so then that gives governance. We have our board for UETN. There's also the State Board of Education who drives some statewide initiatives. But then each local school district would then, the local school board would be responsible for developing their own technology plans.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Fox and Mr. Timothy. Last question. Are these operated through public-private partnerships, or how do you have private entities that are investing and receiving returns on investment and things of that nature as they're going through these implementations? 1,000 school districts versus our 87. Now, we run rather large school districts, so are pretty large where we're concerned in New Mexico. We're struggling also with the strategy of public-private partnerships. I think we're probably going to do something on that in the next year or two. But are you running public-private partnerships to make this happen for yourselves?
We view ours as a public-private partnership because of the collaborative model that we have.
Okay.
But we don't go out and solicit funding or anything like that. Our funding again comes from a state appropriation, E-rate dollars, grants that we're able to secure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. T right, thank you.
Louis, you're muted. I can see that you're trying to respond, but you're muted.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
We are a 501c3. And so our schools sign letters authorizing us to act on their behalf. So we do the procurements, we do the contract negotiations, we work with the private sector partners, we get the subsidies for them, and so on. So it's an attractive thing. One thing that the legislature does do that is tremendously helpful, as I mentioned earlier, is these special appropriations to enhance the connectivity to the hardest to reach schools in the state. Those have allowed us to do some pretty creative work. And over the last 3 years, we've gotten to about 500 of the hardest to reach schools and enhance the connectivity. And what we can do sometimes in those instances is we'll work with a carrier and we'll say, well, look, we've got a remote research site here, there's a clinic here, there's a community college satellite, there's a school, and we figure out how to make it attractive to the carrier, but also bring the prices down to all of our members by leveraging one subsidy.
Well, gosh, Madam Chair, Jen and Mr. Fox and Mr. Timothy, outstanding information. You gave me a lot of great ideas. I'm so glad I got to participate in this part of the discussion. We are on the verge of making some wonderful things happen in our state, and I think this was all very helpful, very timely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Our next person is Susan Herrera, Representative Susan Herrera.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all the three panelists. It was a great presentation. I guess my first question is for Jen, and I was looking at your map of the New Mexico map that you have here, the UNN, what's it called, the Gigapop?
Albuquerque Gigapop. Yep.
Albuquerque, thank you. The Albuquerque Gigapop. I was wondering, can you explain why you did the microwave service out to Gallup? Will you use that method, and how much was the cost there?
The information that's on the Albuquerque Gigapop map, I don't have the details you're asking for, but I would be glad to follow up with you and put you in touch with someone there that can get you that information with that specific question.
Okay, I'm just curious. I know that's really a really unpopulated area of our state to go out there. We've all driven that many times, so I'm just curious why they use that microwave and how much it must have been a cost savings effort. And would anybody else be able to answer that? Do any of the other panelists use microwave, a microwave path in your internet as an internet provider?
We've used microwave in Utah. Down in the Four Corners area specifically, we're still using microwave, and the reason we use microwave is because it's been we haven't been able to actually put fiber, but we have those projects in the future, and we're working towards that. And we have that phase 2 of the San Juan project will be the final hurdle, and then we'll be 100% connected throughout the state.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. Thank you so much. So microwave is just a precursor until you can get fiber. That's how it's used.
Yes and no. I mean, we have probably 150 fixed wireless connections to schools, to libraries, to remote research sites. So while we are always desirous of fiber everywhere, we also are realistic about what it takes to build fiber to some of these communities. And, interim may be 5 years or longer. And we've gotten very, very good service. We have gotten I mean, it depends on how close the fiber is to the site, and depends on the specifics of the geography. But we have done from 1 to 10 gigabits symmetrical to many sites. So it's been comparable to what we would get from fiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. I also would like to ask Mr. Timothy. I was looking at your annual budget is $52,800,000 a year. Is that correct? That's what your annual budget for the UTIM.
Yes.
When you put these people together and these services together, did you do that by statute? Did you demand that public education, higher ed, telehealth, libraries, all these people through statute had to join this network, or did you just set it up and invite them to come in?
The latter. My predecessors actually were the ones who negotiated that, and I was at the school district level at the time. But as I saw the services that were being provided from UETN, I couldn't replicate it within my own school district. And so it was a very good incentive, especially where I didn't have to pay any of the circuit costs. So they were invited to join, and it took us a while. Some of our larger school districts felt like they wanted to control 100% of their networking, and then eventually they saw that the service we provided made it much more attractive for them to join.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Timothy. How long did this process take?
For ours, again, it's just evolved over time. That was back in the mid '80s when we started talking about local area networks and wide area networks, and so from the '80s until now.
Well, so you're talking about 40 years that we have to catch up with you. So if we wanted to do this in New Mexico, let's say we wanted to combine all these people and do a network like this in New Mexico, and we wanted to fast forward it. If you were writing legislation to encourage people to do this, how would you set that up?
Well, I know what we did we have the Digital Teaching and Learning Initiative in the state of Utah right now, and what happened with that was driven legislatively with the educational community's support. But we brought all stakeholders together, and we wrote up the plan, developed the plan, and then the legislature supported it and provided funding for it. So that's why when we had the soft closure of schools, we had a one-day stop, and then we were able to go all online throughout the rest of the state at that time, because the legislature had invested over about a 5-year period prior to now, and so we were able to continue with educating our students. So perhaps that approach, I think, as you work collaboratively and bring in the education community and sit down and identify those things that you want to accomplish, I think with many people having that input, you'll come up with a plan that would be very attractive.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. I'd like to thank all the speakers. Oh, someone else?
Yeah, I was gonna, Louis. Go ahead.
Oregon has done this recently, and they did it in an interesting way. It was state government partnering with the higher education institutions. It's so their network is going to serve state government and all of education eventually, but they made the fiscal agent one of the higher education institutions, and they immediately went out and got fiber IRUs and started working with various telcos. And they have made extraordinary progress in 2 years. Just extraordinary progress.
Madam Chairman, members of the panel, it seems like our oversight, goes back and forth between different agencies in our state. There's always seems to be a power grab for who's in charge, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I guess in the state of Utah, is it UETN that controls how all this is done?
When it comes to the statewide network, yes. Of course, we work with the legislature and we work with all of our stakeholders. Our board is made up of higher ed, public libraries, telehealth. Anyone that we serve, we have representation on our board. So the board is the one who actually drives our direction, and then I'm responsible for the day-to-day operation of the organization.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Timothy. And I'm curious, do you have to go to something like a public regulations commission in your state? Is there such a thing? Do you have to go and check in with them to get approval for your plans at the will of your board?
No. We report to the Retirement and Independent Entities Subcommittee or Appropriations Committee. It's because we are considered as an independent entity.
Madam Chair, Mr. Timothy, thank you. And Mr. Fox, could you tell me how California works? How does your network within the state of California? Do you have to then go, you make a decision within your network, do you then have to go to a Public Utilities Commission or regulatory body in your state?
No, it's all driven by our board of directors have fiduciary responsibility and work hand in glove with the staff on strategic planning and so on. If for instance, if K-12 and it could be the State Board of Education, it could be the State Superintendent's Office, if they say, connectivity is a priority, it would be the State Superintendent's Office and the State Board going to the legislature, asking for an appropriation. Those funds would then go to their agent, and their agent would then work with us.
Madam Chair, members of the panel, thank you very much. This has been very helpful.
Can I add in one more model?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. This is back to your question in terms of the incentive for institutions to connect. Louis Fox mentioned the California Telecommunications Fund, that state fund, if I've got that correct, Louis, that helps helps subsidize some of the connections within the state based on priorities. An example in North Carolina with one of our QUILT members that run the research and education network there. So North Carolina has a similar state telecommunications fund, and how that state government uses that fund is when schools apply for their E-rate subsidy. We talked about the federal program, whether that's 70, 80, 90% discount. Schools are allowed to submit and request that the difference be made up by that state telecommunications fund. However, the state will not grant the funds or not consider granting the funds unless it's used to connect to the research and education network there in that state. So the funds have to be used to be able to connect. So that's how a partnership works there, and to grow the incentive. It's not a mandate by the state that you have to connect. If you want to use your own dollars to do something different, you're more than welcome to. But if you want to submit for a subsidy from the state, from their telecommunications fund, it needs to go to use a connection to the state research and education network.
Madam Chair, thank you for that, Jen. I appreciate that very much. And I would also like to say that, like Utah, I've worked with a lot of rural school districts as a foundation director, and it's been my experience that small rural school districts and their board members, not that they don't want to, but they really don't have the capacity to figure out exactly what they should do when it comes to buying, making a huge purchase in internet, or knowing what the best systems are, or knowing how they can best use their resources to gain the most internet or broadband possible. So I think we're struggling with the same issues, and so we're struggling with how do we get everybody on the same path using our dollars in the best possible way. Do all of you help these school districts or entities with filling out grants? Do you have people that help them write these grants for federal funds?
Yes, we run a consortium for one for K-12 and one for libraries, and we fill out. Well, we have an E-rate consultancy that we employ, and they fill out all the forms for the schools.
We likewise do the same for the E-rate program. But then for any projects the school districts want to do on their own, we provide consulting services. They usually come to us and say, this is what we want to do. How's the best way to design that? And so our engineers will sit down with them and help them design what they feel is the most appropriate plan.
You know, I've written, Madam Chair and members of the panel, I've written one of those grants. They're just impossible. With a group of scientists at the lab, so I have them to help me, but really it's very difficult work to do, and I don't think we can expect small rural school districts to be, or hospitals or libraries, to be able to handle that kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we have Representative Ferrari. Did you have a question? Okay. That looks like we're done. We appreciate your presentations. And I know that Rachel has your communications addresses if a member wishes to further talk with you. So,
absolutely, we're available for future communication questions. You know, there's additional information that came up that I'll follow up with Tim for, but please reach out to Louis, to Ray, to myself if you'd like other examples or have other questions.
Okay.
Yes, we're definitely up for that, and I think we sort of often can join in common cause in the West because we face similar kinds of complexities and obstacles in our states.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
And I was mistaken. I said Representative Figueroa, and I was staring at Representative Ferrari, but you don't have a question, Representative, either? Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much. Oh, wait, we do have a question. Okay.
We have a comment.
We have a comment.
So, Madam Chair, this is not related to this presentation, though. So when we're finished with this, I didn't do something the last time I should have.
Madam Chair, I do believe Representative Figueroa has a question or a comment.
Madam Chair, am I recognized?
Yes, you are. I thought you shook your head and said, no, you don't have a question.
No, I was trying to nod, but that's all right. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, presenters, for a really informative presentation that poses a lot of interesting ideas for us here in New Mexico. And I understand that your work is focused on research and education and expanding into telehealth. We've not heard very much about a corollary when we're talking about expanding broadband, and that's economic development or business and commercial use. And Mr. Timothy mentioned it briefly when he talked about, if I heard him correctly, when he talked about putting out an RFP and telecoms being interested in the bid, because they run parallel lines as they're building out capacity. They run parallel lines not for E-rate, but for commercial. Did I hear that correctly? And do you have any other comments about any overlap?
Yes, I can say that. They take advantage of when they're putting the fiber in for us, that they throw strands of fiber in for themselves, so that they then can work with the local businesses and the households in providing internet connectivity to those communities.
We do something similar where for our broadband consortia or for a county or for a municipality, we generate a list of who's connected, how they're connected, by whom, who's in the works, and who's been asking us questions about getting connected, so that then we can potentially develop a partnership with that community that might bring residential and business broadband to underserved or unserved communities.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, thank you very much. Again, presenters, thank you, and I apologize for that confusing commentary. I was staring at a member in the House, and I was trying to say the name of the person online, so my apologies. You all have a very good rest of the day, and we appreciate that you were here. Great information. For those of you...
Thank you very much.
Senator Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the last time we met, you were with your grandson. We were all jealous, but I failed to thank the people that gave us the lunch, and it was the Council of University Presidents. So I just wanted to make sure that we thanked them for the lunch last month. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and we'd also like to thank today's lunch providers, the College Board. So thank you very much. And if there are no more questions, then we are recessed until tomorrow morning at 9. You all have a good evening. Drive safely. Bye-bye.